بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد صلاة تنجينا بها من جميع الأهوال والآفات وتقضينا بها جميع الحاجات وتطهرنا بها من جميع السيئات وترفعنا بها عندك أعلى الدرجات وتبلغنا بها أقصى الغايات من جميع الخيرات في الحياة وبعد الممات. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي ورسول الله. بسم الله. So this is our third session in a series of sessions around community trauma and abuse and these kind of topics. First of all, before I begin, I should note that it's likely that there will be portions of this that are a little bit adult friendly, shall we say. So if you have smaller kids, it's up to you, but you might want to just pay attention to certain portions of it, inshallah, especially when Dr. Mariam begins, inshallah. I think Yasser would be okay. Sound is fuzzy. Anyone hearing background noise? Sound is fuzzy. I can hear echoing. You know, let me try something. Marcus, if we mute your side and unmute. Let's try this. Is that any better? Sound people? Zoom people? Is that any better? It's better. Okay, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. That's great. We didn't even have to turn it off and turn it back on again. All right, bismillah. So first thing is that some things might be a little bit adult friendly. And second thing, inshallah, alhamdulillah, we're very honored and happy to have a couple of guests with us today. They were also with the ladies retreat yesterday. So we have Dr. Mariam Sheibani and Reehab Ramadan. I was not given a title and I was told not to use one, and every time I have to say your name, I'm like, I don't know what to do. This is really awkward. But Reehab, mashallah, very special and esteemed people, alhamdulillah. So I'll share a few words first. Actually, my portion finished 2 minutes ago, according to our timeline. So I'll try to keep it short, and then after that, we'll hear from them, inshallah. So, is this? Oops, I think the Zoom got messed up. Oh, okay, I see. Bismillah. So anyways, I was supposed to say a few words in the beginning about spiritual abuse more broadly. So Bismillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, and then we'll pass it over for the secret marriage conversation, inshallah. So when I think about spiritual abuse, what basically comes to mind for me is when people use religion or religious teachings and they hold it over against other people. So they basically weaponize religion. And that happens in a number of different settings, actually. I think that a lot of these conversations around spiritual abuse have been popularized in a sense as relates to religious leaders or teachers and their communities. But I think that if we think about spiritual abuse more broadly, then there's other implications for this as well. So there's 3 categories that I'll touch on very quickly. The first category that we see perhaps regularly is this And there's a line here between what's abusive and what's kind of like encouraging or educating and so on. So the first is in relationship to, let's start with parents and children. Okay, so in parents, obviously we want to educate our children. We want them to understand what is right and wrong according to the teachings of the religion. We want to prepare them to deal with the world and, and all of these type of things. The line, is when maybe the tool or the sledgehammer, so to speak, becomes religion. So I'll give you an example actually that comes to mind is one American Muslim scholar. He was, and this is going to don't get derailed on, actually I won't say the holiday, then you won't get as derailed. So he did a research on whether or not a particular holiday is halal or haram for Muslims to partake in. And his children knew about this. And then when that holiday came, he told them, no, you're not going out. You're not doing anything for this holiday. And they're like, but you're the one who wrote the paper that said that it was halal this holiday was halal, right? And he's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean I want you doing it. And I thought that was really interesting because theoretically he could have been like, yeah, well, that's the opinion that I came to in the paper, but actually the opinion I think is this or whatever. He could have used the haram card, right? Somehow he could have used the haram card, but he didn't. He chose to make it like, look, I'm your father, and I don't think that you should go out today. And I don't think you should be part of this. And these are my reasons. And I don't have to say that it's haram in order for me to justify me not wanting you to do this, right? And so this, I think, is part of it. It's like oftentimes what we see in parents with children is very much like two issues. Number one is, how do I make something haram so that I can tell my child not to do it? Which is not really the way that it works, right? And someone who's like, especially when I was teaching, this was like very common, right? Oh, I don't want my child to do this. Can you tell them it's haram? I'm like, but can we talk about whether or not it's haram for a second? Like there is some sort of like discourse on this point. There's actual fiqh around this question. Like, is it actually haram or not? I was like, no, I don't really care about that. I want you to enforce what I'm saying. It's like, I can enforce what you're saying, but from the perspective of like, your parents have wisdom, you should listen to them. But I can't say it's haram if it's not haram by everyone, right? So this is the first issue that kind of, like the haram card gets used a lot. The second card that gets used a lot is the card of Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, the obey your parents card. So we're not going to open the fiqh on that one right now either, but the point is to say that in our relationship with our children, we want to empower them, we want to teach them, we want to give them tools to make decisions in their lives. We want them to be able to make decisions that are good for them and stay away from things that are bad for them and so on and so forth. And guilt tripping them on matters of religion doesn't always serve that purpose. And especially as, we talk to a lot of college students, we talk to a lot of young people, and a lot of like the issues sometimes are dealing with how do I undo this training that I had, where anytime my parents wanted to control me, it became a matter of religion. And I see them in the way that they live their lives, and like a lot of their decisions don't really have to do with religion. But now when it comes to controlling me, they want to use religion, and like people understand this. It becomes part of their internal makeup, right? They see the dichotomy. So this is one category. Second category, where it's very common to see matters of spiritual abuse, if we're to talk about them in the sense of, again, weaponizing religion to get something out of someone else or position yourself with someone else or whatever else it might be. The other place where we see this is I was told to make it more generally as spouses, but frankly, usually more husband to wife. But it happens the other way too, but oftentimes this happens in a husband to wife situation. A kind of corollary of this oftentimes is with wives who are converts. See, very common actually, that people want to marry a convert and they marry the convert, and alhamdulillah, I get to tell them everything that the religion is. So I want it to be this way, I want it to be that way, I want it to be this, I want it to be that. And it becomes really ugly, subhanAllah, like it's really disgusting. But this is an area where it happens too. Like you have to do this or else, the punishment of Allah, so on and so forth. And part of what's going to come up in Dr. Mariam's presentation is some issues around maybe how the law works on these things. Because sometimes we look at something in a relationship and we're like, okay, this is the right that the husband has, for example, whatever it might be. Well, that doesn't mean you get to take your right by force. And what that means is essentially, like if the right doesn't want to be filled in some sort of way, then your option then is to get divorced. That's your option. It's not to forcibly take your right from someone. So there's a lot of issues in terms of how we understand the law that need to be worked through. Inshallah, we'll see if we can get to them. Number 3, obviously, is more popularized, is the problem of spiritual abuse and so on from a religious leader to a community member. I feel like I've talked about this issue every 2 weeks for the last 4 years at the Majlis. So, I feel like I'm saying too much at this point, but what I would say is that part of why, we've said this a lot of times, but obviously it's wrong. Someone in a position of religious leadership is using their knowledge and their position to take advantage of someone else in any sort of way. Sometimes it happens, but generally speaking, like the most common are issues of money and issues of women. So if we're going to be blunt, most common is issues of money and issues of women. So obviously it's wrong for someone to use their position like that. How do we protect against something like that? And this maybe comes to the last point that I'll say before passing it on, is that it's very important, very, very important. And one of the reasons why we really focus on education at the Majlis is because there's a huge power differential when you don't know anything. When you know some things, the power differential becomes a little bit less, at least. At least you can start to think about, well, that doesn't sound right to me. That doesn't seem okay to me. I thought there was consensus on this issue. This is very common. I'm like, well, I thought there was consensus on this issue. Isn't there consensus that like men that are not related to women can't touch them? And like, I think there's consensus on that. So, okay, so now it helps us to be able to say like, okay, there's a red flag here, there's a red flag here, there's a red flag here, there's something that should be an issue here, which we want to be able to, in the end, we want to be able to worship our Lord and understand what we're doing and understand why we're doing it and be able to hold ourselves accountable, to be able to hold others accountable, to be able to understand the nature of relationships, to be able to understand, like to have enough life experience and wisdom to be able to say, okay, this doesn't seem right. And in communities also, we can do that. We can make things more natural. We can have conversations with each other that encourage that. But in the end, if someone, one of the issues that comes up a lot, and this is an issue that people may differ with me, but I tend to be a little bit more strict on this one. Because what's very common, this will be my last point, very common that happens when there's a spiritual abuse issue with the religious leader, what does everyone always say? Oh, there's tawbah, there's repentance, there's forgiveness, we should forgive people, so on. So it's always what happens, right? And that's true, but there's also amana, there's also responsibility, there's also trust, there's also the burden of leadership. And so whenever people talk to me about it, it's like, well, so-and-so did X, Y, Z. Like, okay, well, but they made tawbah and we should bring them back, should let them speak again. Like, well, if they're in a position of leadership and they betrayed that position of leadership in a very like foul way, then they can make tawbah and alhamdulillah come and pray. Alhamdulillah, make tawbah and come and pray. But they don't have to like hold the mic. That's a whole different thing. Right? Hold the mic and be pointed to and considered a teacher and so on and so forth. Like once you hold the mic, you've taken on a position that you have more responsibility now. It's the way it is. So I think that there's a lot of things to discuss here, but I'll pass it on to the presenters because they're better equipped to discuss them. and we're very happy to have them. So I don't know if I was sent the full bios. Did you send them to me? No, I didn't get them. Oh, yeah, I do have it. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm going to read both bios now so that we can kind of more seamlessly move between our two speakers. First is Dr. Mariam Sheibani. She's an assistant professor in history at the University of Toronto and lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College. She received her PhD in Islamic thought from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Prior to joining the University of Toronto, she was a research fellow at Harvard Law School and lecturer at Harvard Divinity School. Her research interest focuses on medieval Islamic intellectual and cultural history, but they focus on the theory and practice of Islamic law. She has studied with Muslim scholars and conducted research in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, North America, the UK, and West Africa. This is Dr. Mariam Sheibani, the one who's right next to me. Okay. On her side is Reehab Ramadan. She has a master's in counseling psychology and is a certified practitioner with the International Association of Islamic Psychology. Having lived in various Islamic countries, Reehab has been able to take mentors and guides to help weave her understandings of psychology and the teachings of Islam to reach an Islamically integrated approach of psychology and healing. Her focus is helping people return to states of health by focusing on innate realities through Islamic psychology and traditional wisdoms of nurturing the soul. So alhamdulillah, we're very honored and happy to have them with us. They both come from internationally, mashallah, like they really went out of their way to come for these programs, and so we're grateful to them for that. We'll have to hand it over to Dr. Mariam, inshallah. That's good for you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك فيك علما يا الله سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو رب افتح بالحق وأنت خير الفاتحين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum everybody and good evening. It's really a pleasure and a blessing to be with you. Thank you to Shaykh Muslima and Shaykh Jamaal for this invitation. So inshallah, the presentation I'll be sharing today is a summarized, it's very long, but it's a summarized version of a longer paper that inshallah I'll be publishing soon that I wrote as commissioned by the HERMA project. Who here has heard about the HERMA project? Yeah, if you haven't, it's something that if you're interested in these questions and these issues, something you want to look into. A project started by Dr. Ingrid Masson in order to reintroduce and to sustain Hurma, the sanctity of every believer in Muslim communal spaces. So it's really focused on particularly the accountability and responsibility of religious leaders to uphold the norms and the ideals and the teachings of the faith as they serve the Muslim community. So a really important project. And this paper is one that I've shared in smaller scholarly kind of academic workshops for the HERMA project that inshallah will be published in their project as well. So the issue of secret marriages, these are some things that I've personally heard and encountered with respect to secret marriages. Things like I checked and it's halal. Right.
Hello.
There's nothing wrong with me marrying a married man in secret. And I put in red the operative words and understanding the conceptual categories in which people are placing or imagining these particular acts to be considered. So what does halal mean? Is it truly halal? And what does nothing wrong imply? Or speaking to the wife of a husband who did marry the second wife in secret, saying my husband didn't do anything wrong according to the Sharia. So what is the Sharia and what does something wrong imply? And then another kind of statement or understanding or assumption, if Fulan is doing it, then it must be okay, right? A fair assumption and understanding. And then finally, a reaction to all of the above really is how can God allow this, right? Essentially, referring to secret marriages amounting to affairs. So we'll come back to this later on in the presentation, but these are some of the categories, I would say, error categories that we make in discussing this issue of halal, sharia, wrong, okay. We have to really unpack what do we think these terms mean, and where should they be embedded and understood in a broader context. So I'm going to actually just share with you the arguments that I'll be presenting, and then I'll present the argument and come back to the summary of the argument towards the end. So first of all, secret marriages, which are defined differently in different schools of thought, are both invalid, contractually invalid, and also prohibited. Okay. Now, some arrangements, let's say, that we would describe as semi-secret, meaning the parties that absolutely need to be involved are involved, may, and that's a very big maybe, okay, may meet formal requirements and conditions to be considered technically valid, okay, technically valid as a contract by some schools. So a lot of ifs and maybes within that statement, okay? But even if we were to validate contractually, right, certain arrangements that we would say as a marriage contract, that contract is valid, we would still say that these arrangements are immoral, that they're religiously deficient, that they run counter to the sunnah, and they may be a mere sham for illicit relationships, okay? So something can be contractually valid, and this is something that cuts across Islamic law. You can say it's a valid contract, it's a valid marriage, it's a valid divorce, it's a valid contract of exchange, but it's still haram to do it, or it's related to many other haram acts. And the people involved in that exchange, one or both parties, are liable for all of the other problematic actions that they engage in undertaking that contract, in enacting that divorce, and so on and so forth, okay? So if something is valid, doesn't mean it's okay. Religiously, it's okay. It's permissible even. It's moral, etc., etc. So I'll come back to this in a minute, but this is the basic argument of the paper. So these are the parts of the presentation that I'll share with you today. First of all, the sunnah and the purposes of an Islamic marriage, right? We don't want to lose sight of what does marriage mean? What is marriage for? What did God and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ intend for marriage to be as a foundational understanding for everything that comes after it? And then we'll talk about the very technical details about the fiqh of marriage, right? So when we say a secret marriage is prohibited and invalid, and some semi-secret arrangements may be valid, but still problematic, what does that actually mean? And then we're going to zoom out from the question of validity to a broader understanding of the nuanced fiqh of marriage, okay? So looking now at morality in the sunnah and how these things should inform our understandings and our engagement within our relationships. And then finally, I'll end with some conclusions or recommendations for us, particularly as minority communities in the West, for addressing this issue that has become. So to begin now with the sunnah or the purposes of marriage, as we know that the Quran refers to marriage as mithaqan ghaliza, right? A solemn covenant. And this word mithaq in the Quran is used to refer to agreements or covenants that God takes with various prophets and various religious communities, particularly Bani Israel. So when God is referring to a relationship which we think of as a worldly or secular relationship as a mithaq, it's no longer just a aqd. It's not just a contract between two people to regulate a worldly relationship, but it's indicating to us it has this transcendental, it has a horizontal relationship tying two people together, but more importantly, that it has a vertical relationship that these two people are coming into an agreement and an understanding and a bond between themselves, but also between God. And when the exegetes and mufassirin talk about, well, what is the mithaq al-ghaliza? Some of them say it's the ijab and the qabul, the spoken or the verbal contract that actually enacts the marriage. And others say, no, it's actually the prophetic teaching where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ at the farewell pilgrimage tells his community, and this, as you know, this particular moment is really important. It's his final one of his final statements and counsels to the community is "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayran," right? That I be reverent with regard to women. That this is the mithaq on Khalil, right? So this is the understanding and the teachings of, and there's many other verses in a hadith that we can consider. But of course, always we go back to the exemplary behavior and conduct of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he says that the best of you are the best of you to your families, and I am the best of you to my family. And we're very fortunate as a community, right? Unlike previous communities, like the community of Isa salam and others, that we actually have an embodied example of how to conduct ourselves in family life. And one of the wisdoms that the scholars talk about as to why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ married so many women is for us to be able to collate as much information about his private life as possible, right? That they all told us about what he was like in the privacy of his home, right? So a lot more could be said about this, of course, but this always needs to animate the background to any discussion about marriage. So thinking about what are the goals of an Islamic marriage, we usually focus on the first one, right? The individual function of the function or the purpose of marriage for the two people getting married, right? That we want to ensure, and as a primary objective, the happiness and fulfillment of both spouses in every sense of the word, right? And the lasting chastity between the two spouses, etc., etc. But it also has other functions that need to be taken into account when two people enact and engage in a marriage. So there's social functions, right, between families, that families also have a stake and they have a right when two people from those families are marrying. It facilitates these connections between families, it facilitates the transmission of wealth, the transmission of culture, the transmission of religion, and so on. So families have a stake in that as well, and therefore an involvement in that as well. And then beyond that, as a Muslim community, especially in a minority context, that marriage is really, really important for us in reproducing a stable and a healthy Muslim community, and in ensuring the continuity of religious practice and of a sound and healthy understanding and practice of that religion. So sometimes it might appear to two individuals who want to marry, right, that the social rights and the communal rights of their marriage is actually undermining or it's cutting against what they would like. Like they can't fulfill their happiness and their fulfillment because their families won't allow that marriage, or the community doesn't want that marriage, or whatever it may be, right? But in actual fact, the fact that there is this social and this communal function to marriage actually helps the couple fulfill their long-term happiness and their long-term fulfillment. Because when we engage in marriage in a public way and with the blessings of family and the blessings of community, it puts us in a better position to actually trust that our partner will honor their rights and their commitments to us. When we marry in secret, for example, it's just you and that person, and you don't have your family to involve them in the process, to benefit from their experience in that process. But also it actually further reinforces for the two people their commitment. In doing something publicly, you're reinforcing for yourself your commitment to that relationship, that this is something that's going to be long-term, that this is something I'm committing to in the eyes, not just of me and my partner, but in the eyes of our family and our community, right? So it doesn't in fact, this public knowledge and recognition and announcement of marriage doesn't obstruct a couple's long-term happiness, but actually secures and strengthens it. It might, in the short term, be more difficult, it might take longer, but in the long term, it actually secures that commitment and that happiness for them. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the fiqh of marriage, and this is a little bit more technical, the most technical part of the presentation. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say a few things about how fiqh works and what are some of the categories and the concepts that we need to know to be able to understand this discussion. So first of all, that fiqh is mostly concerned with regulating outward actions. Other aspects of religion, virtues and tazkiyah and tasawwuf will be more concerned with inward states and intentions and inclinations and so on. But fiqh wants to know, it's all about behavior and action, right? So when you pray, your intention and your khushu'ah isn't really the purview of fiqh. Fiqh is going to tell you these are things you have to do outwardly, your wudu, ruku'ah, sujood, etc., for the prayer to be valid and accepted from an outward perspective. The inward state is something that's considered by the same scholars, right, but in different books in a different discourse, okay? So fiqh is concerned with regulating outward actions, and it's concerned with observable outward conduct. So there's a lot that I can say about this, but I'm just gonna continue. And in terms of any given human act, right, it's gonna categorize it as you know, either it's haram, it's prohibited, it's obligatory, it's wajib, it's recommended or disliked, right? Recommended, something that is strongly recommended, but not strictly obligatory. Disliked, it's makruh or it's permitted. And there's also going to be a second categorization of acts of worship and contracts to say if that act of worship or that contract is valid or invalid. But again, there isn't this simple overlap that if something is permitted or if something is valid, therefore it's permitted or recommended or obligatory. Something could be valid and it's also prohibited, okay? So there isn't this one-to-one. When something is valid, it just means that that exchange is valid. So this is actually not a correct example, but let's just say this is Reehab water, okay? And then I stole this water and then I sold it to Jamaal, okay? This is a valid contract and I exchanged his cup. So I exchanged this cup for this cup, okay? This is a valid exchange. But the fact that I stole this from Reehab, that doesn't mean that that's okay. Or if I took this water and I made wudu with it, that wudu would still be a valid wudu. But the fact that it's stolen water is still a separate problem, okay? So there's all sorts of divorces and marriages and contracts that it's valid, but it doesn't mean it's fine, okay? So important to recall that. The next thing I'll say is that validity, that category of validity, is usually based on very minimal essential requirements. The baseline for validity is very low, okay? And that, again, very good reason, because when something is valid, then that means that the effects of that contract or that act are completed, they're enacted. And jurists, generally speaking, as a general rule, they want to validate as many contracts, especially marriages, as possible, retroactively. Because once a couple consider themselves to be married, right, that means there could be children, and you want those children to be born in wedlock. You don't want the couple to be liable for a zina punishment. You want mutual inheritance rights and duties to be applied and so on. So generally speaking, you want to validate things as much as possible. And this is also like in the hudud, right? If you have in punishments in criminal law, it's the threshold is very, very high to actually enact the punishment. And any type of doubt is going to remove that punishment, like very, very small doubts. So there's low thresholds and high thresholds for good reason. From a kind of reasonable sense, it makes sense. And then, okay, so then let's look at what are the legal minimums for an Islamic marriage. There's these core elements that we would recognize: the consent of both parties, the permission of the bride's guardian, the actual contract, spoken contract, sometimes written, the dower that's gifted by the husband to the wife. There's details about all of these things in the various schools of law, but the two most important, and what I'll be focusing on today, is the two witnesses that attest to the union and the public proclamation of the marriage. These are the things that come into play, obviously, when you're talking about secret marriages. And then, of course, there's other recommended sunan or customs, like hosting a public celebration, the delivery of a sermon, the written contract, and so on, all of which indicate, again, the very public nature and the prophetic teaching of a public nature, a walima, to have, adin nikah, even with the drums, and they would consider that an exception to the proscription of music, right? Walimas are an exception, have drums, make noise, let everybody know, right? So all these customs indicating, again, the public nature of marriage. So these 2 points I'm going to focus on here of witnesses, two witnesses, and public proclamation. Where do these requirements come from? They come directly from the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In particular, these two ahadith that have many, many transmissions and different narrations. The first is to proclaim the marriage publicly, adin nikah, even if it were with the beating of a drum. So a command from the Prophet to publicly proclaim the marriage. And a second hadith that says there is no marriage without two witnesses. In some narrations, two upright witnesses. and in some narrations, 2 upright witnesses and a guardian possessing good judgment, waliyun murshid. So there's, again, this is just 2 ahadith, but if you actually let's say you read through a book of hadith, just looking for the idea of marriage in the prophetic community, right? You would find, and you could aggregate all of the different ahadith that would give you a really clear sense that everything about the prophetic example and the prophetic teaching is completely antithetical to a secret marriage enacted and maintained behind closed doors without the knowledge of family and community. You can very confidently say that. And what I mean is, someone will come to the prophet and they'll be like, I want to get married. This happens, a conversation here, a conversation there, an anecdote here, an anecdote there. All like the prophetic community, marriage is a public, it's ridiculous that I actually have to say this in these terms. Marriage is a public institution. Like it's not, shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And in fact, I would say for most kind of non-scholarly Muslims, we know that intuitively. From the time we're this small, we go to marriages, we have to get dressed up, we don't want to go, all these things, right? But there's a culture of marriage is public. You go, you get an invitation, and you attend, right? So talking now about so these are the prophetic teachings around marriage. Now, the job of the fuqaha, the jurists, is to determine very precise regulations, dawabit, for these elements that the Prophet Muhammad required, okay? So what they have to do is to say, okay, we have to have witness attestation, we have to have proclamation, like they would do with the dower. What's the minimum dower that's acceptable, etc., right? And so they're going to say, well, what's the minimum that's required to say something is a valid marriage, right? So they have to have very precise regulations. Now, when these jurists set out these very precise regulations, they're not saying that's all you should do. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that if 2 people come to court, right, especially when these discussions start out in the early period, and there's a whole kind of history around that, Muslims are a minority community, they're still kind of working out the legalities. The question is, what's the minimum to be able to say these 2 people are validly, legally married before in the eyes of the law? That's the question that the jurists are talking about. And they're going to also say, however, you should do X, Y, and Z. The sunnah is to do A, B, and C. And it's problematic morally and religiously, etc., if you don't do A, B, and C. Like you should have a walima, you should do this. But the question is this a valid marriage or not in a court setting? Right? The teachings and the details that come up, these are for training jurists to act as judges and act as muftis. So when people come to them, retrospectively, they already think they got married, right? So let me give you a parallel example. The parallel example is nursing, right? If somebody was nursed by a mother, right? If let's say, okay, you guys know the discussion, right? That if a nurse brother, or what is it called, nursing sibling, right? That if their mother nursed you, you can't marry them. So the discussion is like, how many times did you suck from her breast? That's the details, because retrospectively, these things come up, right? Even till today, where people will come to court and say, we don't actually know, did they actually nurse them? We're not sure, or she lived in that town, a woman in that town nursed him, but we don't know which woman it was, things like that. So these are the details that come up in real cases in judge setting. This is not a recommendation for what we should and shouldn't do, okay? So anyways, to just belabor that point, there's 2 different kind of approaches to this whole question of witnesses and proclamations. So there's the Maliki school, and then there's the 3 other schools that take a slightly different approach. So the Maliki school, they place primacy on the public declaration of the marriage, or i'lan or isha, okay? So they require for a marriage to be valid that it's publicly declared, and that there's an absence of an agreement to keep the marriage a secret. Okay, so they rely on, particularly on this hadith, alimu and nikah, proclaim the marriage publicly, and also the rationale, as a kind of retrospective rationale, which makes good sense, that illicit relationships take place in secret and without the knowledge of people and public knowledge of that union, and illicit relationships take place within a publicly recognized and known union. Therefore, the difference, the demarcation, is that proclamation. Okay, and they would say witnesses are recommended, but they're not strictly required. They want proclamation, and it's kind of like if you have proclamation, then witnesses aren't really that essential. Although again, recommended, right? recommended, but not sufficient. So for the Maliki school, a secret marriage that's not publicly announced is actually invalid. And what I mean by invalid is what I have at the end here. It means that everybody involved in that union is punished. So the husband and the wife would be separated, okay? The paternity of any child is established, but they're separated, and the bride, the mahar would still be due. And then after she completes her iddah, they can then initiate a new valid contract. So they're very strict on this if the marriage is not publicly announced. And they define a secret marriage as, there's two opinions in the school. One of them is that the groom instructs any individual to keep the marriage a secret. Okay, so if the groom tells anybody to keep the marriage a secret, then that means the marriage is a secret marriage and therefore it's void. The other opinion in the school is that the groom instructs specifically the witnesses to keep the marriage a secret. Now, the interesting thing here, and part of like the wisdom, is that if the wife or her guardian are the ones who are initiating the secrecy in the situation, again, it's a problem, but it doesn't immediately invalidate the contract. And what does this indicate, this distinction here? Is that particularly in these situations, women are more vulnerable and that their rights need to be secured even more so. So the groom doing that is seen as a problem, whereas if the wife does that for her family, it doesn't render the contract invalid in that way. Now, the other three schools, the Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Hanbali school, they take a slightly different approach to this. So first of all, they focus on, and the Malikis also have this guardian stipulation, that the wali of the wife in the situation approves of the union and is therefore involved. Now, of course, the wali is kind of like the figurehead or the representative of the family, but he symbolizes that the family of the bride is involved. The idea isn't just that it's the girl and her father secretly, right, without the rest of the family. And that the wali also has to have a certain level of moral standing and integrity, that if he himself isn't religiously kind of deficient and corrupt. Okay? So the Hanbalis and the Shafi'is require this strictly as a condition of marriage. The Hanafis strongly recommend that the wife contract her marriage through her guardian, so strongly recommended, but not strictly required. However, and this is important because this Hanafi position gets abused sometimes, that for the Hanafis, the father or the guardian has this prerogative that if the wife, if his daughter or his ward marries herself to someone who isn't a suitable match for her, that he has the prerogative to then go to court and ask a judge to annul that marriage. So then it would be up to the judge to see whether or not the girl really married herself to someone who's unsuitable or not. But that fact means, it kind of presupposes that the father is involved as well. If he has this, he has this post facto, after the fact right to then go to court if the girl marries herself to an unsuitable match. That means he needs to know about the union, right? So the guardian is essential, and the guardian is a cornerstone of familial involvement, and therefore that means there's a greater number of people involved, and that the interests of the bride in particular are taken into account. And then the second thing is for these schools that proclamation, this publicizing of the marriage, is formalizing by the requirement of a minimum of 2 witnesses. Okay, and again, this is a reliance on this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that there is no marriage without 2 upright witnesses, right? That indicates that if you have 2 upright witnesses, that there is a marriage, right? So based on this, they say that the recommendation, so there's a lot of details here. First of all, that for the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, that 2 upright witnesses, and the Shafi'is are known to be very kind of high level on this, that their requirement of who is an upright witness is very, 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 very high. So there's this joke that a Hanafi and a Shafi'i jurist would attend. This is like 10 years ago. It's a contemporary joke that's really not that funny. But they would attend these marriages together, and then whenever they would attend, they would look at each other, and the Hanafi would be like, so the Hanafis don't require that the witnesses be upright. So Hanafi would look at the Shafi'i and be like, did we meet the uprightness of your Shafi'i witness requirement? And he'd be like, No. So the joke is really, it's very, very hard to meet that requirement. And this isn't just today, but even historically, they recognized that the requirement of uprightness was so, and moral and spirit and religious integrity was so high that very few people met it. So what would they do? They would actually have court-appointed witnesses. So every court, people would have to come and register their marriages in the court, and they would have two people who've been vetted, their integrity, etc., and they would actually witness and sign off on all marriages. And that, again, is an institutionalized practice to ensure and to prevent many, many, many problems, but also to meet this requirement. The other thing that they would do as a very strong recommendation is don't have two people there. Have a large, and it's actually a sunnah to have a large congregation to attest in the hopes that two people in that congregation, God knows them to have this moral religious integrity to ensure that the marriage is indeed meeting these requirements. Right? So two people is by no means a recommendation or the sunnah, but it's the understanding that the Prophet ﷺ said, "La nikaha illa bi shahidain." So we can't say you must have 50 people when the Prophet said you need 2 witnesses as a minimum, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is they were very clear that these witnesses are not a formal just figurehead. They're there for a reason, right? They're there to spread the news. So the families are there, the bride's family is there through the guardian at the very least, and that they're there to spread the news to everybody else. And that's why they have to be upright, because we don't want them hiding testimony or lying, or it didn't really happen or whatever. They need to be upright people so they can actually attest to this marriage. Okay? So they're there to spread the news, to eliminate any doubt about this relationship or potential disavowal that, oh, I never married her, this isn't my child, whatever it might be, right? So they have a function. So what does that mean, right? That means that in this one scenario I heard about in secret marriage, what's the word like in a serial, like the Chronicles, Secret Marriage Chronicles. So here's one that's actually very sad because it was just a friend of mine. So I met her, like I know her from a while ago. Then I met her at a religious conference, one of the beautiful religious conferences. And she's like, I have some great news. I got married. I'm like, oh, congratulations. She's like, he's here, but I can't tell you who he is because it's a secret marriage and he's not ready to tell his family. So I can't tell you. And I was like kind of thrown. This is a while ago actually. I was like thrown and I'm like, okay. She's like, yeah, she's like, we met online and then we got to know each other. He's not ready to tell his family. So then we both flew into the city and then at the airport, we found 2 witnesses. We went to the musalla. We found 2 witnesses. And so imagine this, right? What kind of attestation is this? 2 people traveling to random places in the world, we can never retrieve them, right? Found 2 witnesses, and I'm using the Hanafi position, blah, 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 and we're married, okay? I'm like, okay. So I was thrown, I'm like happy for her. She seemed happy. Okay, I don't know. End of the conference, she's like, yeah, he divorced me. And I'm like, I felt really bad for her, but I'm like, at the same time, like, where's your family? Who is this guy that you found online that married you at the airport? Like, how did you accept all of this? And now, right? So this is not, meaningful attestation of witnesses, okay? So this is the purpose, encourage large attestation. And then this broader addition, in addition to the witnesses who are actually there is this recommendation of public and broader proclamation in conformity to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ of proclaiming and making the marriage a public knowledge. So the question for these schools is, well, what if you have your witnesses there, you've ticked off all the boxes, you have the guardian, you have the mahar, you have everything, and then the 2 witnesses decide they conspire or someone pays them off or I don't know what to keep the marriage a secret. Does that invalidate that marriage? What do you guys think the answer to that would be? So I can have some water. I heard a whisper, yes. Yes, why? Seems what?
The intention. The intention was that.
For the witnesses?
Yeah.
Okay, but what if that happens afterwards? So they get married on January 1st and then January 2nd, somebody comes to them and says, I'll pay you $100,000 if you pretend this didn't happen or you just pretend you weren't there.
I don't think that made that intention within 24 hours.
Okay.
From the start, if the intention going into it corrupt, for lack of better words, then the outcome is going to be wrong.
Okay. Okay, sound reasoning.
In the Maliki madhab, it would invalidate it, but in the other madhab, it would still be valid.
So in the Maliki madhab, it would invalidate it. Why would it invalidate
There's
it?
no proclamation.
There's no what, proclamation?
Yeah. So people do not know about, because the witnesses are keeping it secret, so that minimum requirement of proclamation is gone.
Okay.
What they would consider not upright. Paid off.
So that's the question, right? These witnesses that on January 1st were assumed, let's say they were vetted to be upright, on January 2nd, they got paid off or they got bought off or whatever, right? But the problem with this is that the contract has already been enacted on January 1st. So to retroactively render a contract void is very, very difficult to do. And in a situation like this, if they did pay them off, someone paid them off, why is the couple to blame for that? Wouldn't that be unfairly punitive to the couple if someone pays off the witnesses, or the witnesses were, people thought they were upright, but in actual fact they weren't, right? So again, this isn't a non-problematic scenario. The third party who's paying people off, the witnesses that are being bought off, the secrecy, the fact that there's only 2 people there, there's only 2 that saw them, whatever, there's so many problems in this. But the fact of the matter is it wouldn't retroactively render the contract void. The marriage is still intact. And I would say that that's a reasonable conclusion, even if there's all sorts of other legal religious problems that come into this scenario, right? So if, and I should have had this instructed to, or they themselves devise to conceal it. So this wouldn't be considered, it wouldn't invalidate the contract. But still, the witnesses keeping the marriage a secret is problematic, morally, legally, etc., because it obviously defeats the very purpose for which the witnesses are there, which is to publicize the marriage. It wouldn't retroactively invalidate the marriage. It may for the Malikis. But again, there's all sorts of preventative safeguards already in place, right? Before all of this buying people off happens, right? Which is, first of all, that the witnesses are supposed to have integrity, and that's the first step. So they wouldn't give false testimony or conceal. The bride's guardian is involved, and then a strong recommendation to publicly proclaim the marriage beyond the 2 witnesses. Okay, so this is the technical kind of formal conditions of what would and wouldn't be a valid contract. But that's really like a tiny step A of like A to Z of what Muslim marriage should be and what the teachings around Muslim marriage are, right? So when we say, remember these categories, I said it's halal, it's okay, there's nothing wrong, right? If something is valid, you don't then say Islam allows this, God is happy with this, Islamic law allows, is fine with this, right? Just because something is valid, because law and religion and Sharia more broadly isn't about valid, therefore great, wonderful, okay? So what I mean by that is something like this. So validity is the tiny little circle in the beginning. Step 1, you want to make sure your acts of worships and your contract and your marriages, at the very least, are meeting this minimal baseline of being valid. That's step 1, okay? Now, beyond that, you want to know, is what I'm doing permitted, right? Is it commanded? Is it an obligation? Is it forbidden? What is the ruling about that particular act? Now, usually when we study a introductory here. So when we say that, when you study a basic book of fiqh, you're going to learn X is permissible, X is obligatory, X is forbidden, right? Those are introductory first step fiqh books. So when you say, for example, what's the legal ruling for marriage in general? When you start studying Kitab al-Nikah, it says marriage is, what is it? Like prayer is obligatory, right? Jumu'ah is obligatory for men, blah, blah, blah. What is marriage? Recommended. Is that what it is? That's the default ruling for marriage? So it's actually on a sliding scale, right? It really depends on who is being addressed. So if someone is like, I could marry, I couldn't marry, it wouldn't make much of a difference in how I live or how I feel, it would be permissible, maybe recommended because it's the sunnah. So even if it's something you don't eat or want, still recommended. But for somebody who is unable to fulfill the rights of their spouse, right, but at least the very basic rights of their spouse, it would actually be forbidden or makruh, disliked for that person to marry. And someone who, if they don't marry, they will fall into sin. It's obligatory for that person to marry. So even just the default ruling about a marriage or of an act may just depend on the individual or the person in that situation. Okay? So that's the other thing. So validity, and then what is the legal ruling of, does God require me to do this? Does God forbid me to do this? Is it up to me? Now, beyond all of that, there is sunan of recommendation and disfavor around these things. So something could be, it could be considered, not strictly required or strongly disliked. And that's not like a small thing. I know we're like, okay, what do I absolutely have to do? That's sometimes our mindset. But it's like the Prophet ﷺ commanded this, but you don't absolutely have to do it. That's still a big deal for us to just be like, I'm not going to do it, right? So there's something around sunnah, recommendation, and disfavor. And then beyond all of that, these are all kind of theoretical, abstract categories or categorization. There's something called, and this is like, these are kind of more detailed discussions you'll find in fiqh or fatwa of what's the act configuration, right? The person who's undertaking this marriage, whatever marriage it might be, what is their situation? What other obligations do they have? What are their capacities? What's happening with that person? And that would come up if I go to Shaykh Jamaal and say, Shaykh Jamaal, this is my, so marriage is recommended. And actually, I think for me, I must get married. And then I go to Shaykh Jamaal, this is my situation. I know that marriage is recommended. And however, there's all these other things happening in my life. Should I get married? He might just be like, absolutely not right now. And what does it, I thought it was recommended. It's recommended as a default general statement. Doesn't mean for me right now that it's okay, right? So this is really important in a lot of situations when we think about these quote unquote default, like polygamy, is polygamy recommended or permissible? That's great as a nice default for universally, all times and places, 10th century Baghdad, 18th century Cordoba, not Cordoba, 18th century in India, whatever. But does that actually still apply to me today in 21st century America? That's a whole other question, right? And the act configuration also means what other things, what are the entailments of that act? How does it affect all of my other responsibility? My family, my children, my income, my parents, my community. All of those things are taken into account when determining, should this thing happen? Is this thing good? Should I do this? Am I really obligated to do this or not? Okay, so that's another thing. And then looking at beyond me and my situation, my kind of context, my little circle, there's the rest of the community, okay? And there's the rest of Muslim society. And it's the problem we have here is we don't live in Muslim majority countries, we don't live with healthy institutions, but it's a very normal thing in Muslim history beyond the fiqh that the imam, right, which is the state and the ulama and the community, especially in the Sunni community, that we have this idea that the Muslim community is a self-governing community, right? So the imam is representing all of us. And the imam and all of the state institutions are supposed to look and see this permissible act has now been misused on a widespread level, right? And therefore, the imam will say that permissible thing is no longer permissible, right? And this happens all the time. So from the very beginning of Islamic history, Umar ibn Khattab, one of his governors in Madain, which is this newly opened territory, I think it was Hudayfa, that he wanted to marry, or he had married a Kitabi woman from another country, right? And Umar writes to him and says, you have to divorce her, because right now the Muslim community is this like 1%, they're surrounded by 99% non-Muslims, and if you as the governor marry non-Muslim women, then other young men and people in your administration and elsewhere will think this is okay for them to do. And maybe it is permissible in Islamic law, but in this context, the Muslim community needs to intermarry and not dissolve itself within this larger community that's in. And Imam Malik has the same opinion that in minority context, you don't marry outside of the faith. This is one example of many, many, many examples of marriage practices, financial, transactional, criminal law, all sorts of things that the Muslim community's representation needs to look out and see what's happening and what should be suspended. We're not saying it's now, forevermore not allowed. We're saying right now, this isn't working. It's leading to more harm and abuse. It's going to be suspended for the time being. And then beyond all of that, of the public interest, the maslaha, amma, right? You have a question of what is the spiritual and moral example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaching us to do, right? And if we're really considering, are we leading with our nafs, right, what we want, or are we leading with the best interests of our spiritual development and of our community's development? Usually that's a really easy answer, right? Beyond the fiqh of validity and recommendation and all the rest of it. Okay, so going back now, I need to also wrap up. I want to have some time for questions, but that secret marriages are invalid and prohibited, and that some secret marriages, some may meet formal requirements and be technically valid, maybe. And even if we say yes, we're going to validate that union, it doesn't mean that it's fine and okay and God loves it and the Prophet is happy with it, etc. It just means it's valid. Okay? So we can think a little bit about degrees of legality, secrecy, and morality, because we also don't want to put everything in one category of this is a secret marriage, that's the same thing, right? So if we're not meeting the minimum conditions of legal validity, then that's very easy, right? Prohibited and invalid. Now, there's all sorts of arrangements of these semi-secret marriages, okay? This middle category, where you could say by the standards of one legal school, perhaps, maybe, that it's a valid marriage, okay? You have the minimal requirements of witnesses, you have the involvement of the bride's guardian, the marriage, for some reason or another, isn't made public. Families may not be adequately involved, or in most cases of this scenario, parents might not be involved if it's like two young people in college or something like that, or if the man is already married, that he doesn't apprise and seek the consent of his firstborn. And there's all sorts of problems with these arrangements, okay? And even if somebody was to say, actually, you met all the minimum requirements of the marriage, it doesn't excuse the fact that there's all sorts of other religious, moral problems involved in a marriage like this. So this is the basic argument. Validity doesn't mean okay and fine to do. Lying, deception, web of ongoing lies and deception. It's not a lie and a deception. It's lies of omission, lies of, and again, lies, it's like, oh, recently I was in a situation where someone like lied to somebody else like a lot. And then the person like excusing this was like, I have no problem with his character. It's just an issue with his mushkila fi shakhsiyatihi. And I was like, he's like, the problem is personality. I'm like, no, serial lying is not like a small personality problem. This is like one of the biggest major sins of all. So lying, deception, concealment, etc., etc., etc. Then there's something that's like a private marriage that you meet all of the conditions, you go about it correctly, families or the people who need to know about this marriage, but for some reason or another, you want to keep the marriage private from some people. It's known to some people, but private from others, right? And I would just say that these kind of marriages are really difficult to maintain, even if you could say it's valid legally, difficult to maintain, emotionally taxing on all of the parties involved, right? Especially over the long term, especially if there's children involved, especially if there's a lot of cost to it. But I would just say, in particular, when we're talking about religious leaders, there's also a cost to the community, right? That they have a responsibility not only to act by the dictates of the law, but also to be seen and known to be acting according to the dictates of the law. And that's really beautifully exemplified by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when he's speaking to his wife Sophia outside of the mosque, and two of the Ansar walk by and he says, wait, this is my wife. And they say, like, Hasha lillah, we didn't even think it would be any other woman. And he says, shaitan runs through the veins of the son of Adam as the blood runs. So he wanted to make sure it's not just that he was acting in a way that was above board, he wanted everyone else to know that he was, right? So this religious leaders choosing to keep these second marriages kind of private, secret, it fuels gossip, it fuels rumors, it fuels confusion among people who are like, wait, there's really this, it's completely unacceptable, right? So just to finish off now on some recommendations for Muslims in the West in particular, because if we look at how other jurisdictions and Muslim majority countries are dealing with this, they have institutions in place and they have really interesting ways of dealing with these things, of secret marriages, of second desires for second marriages, of registration, of interviewing the first wife and her family and letting the first wife sign off. They have methods and regulations in place. We have the wild, wild West. So what are some things that, some steps, and some of these, are challenging, but they really have to be discussed. First of all, this public re-education of imams and also ordinary or non-specialist believers, that we need to have a more nuanced understanding of these categories of Islamic law, right? So the fact that our moral compass is so broken that we really think the only difference between marriage and some other arrangement is just two people and signing off on a piece of paper. What do we think marriage is, right? Or cruising, you call someone, I'm with this girl, marriage, okay. What do we think marriage is when it's just two extra people at the airport example, right? That's the difference between marriage or halal meat, right? Is this Big Mac halal or not? That's not the nature of our religious teachings, right? That it's a very superficial and licentious understanding and fatwa shopping in order, if we're being honest, to justify what we want to do and what our ego desires without really paying much attention to, that they're not just forms, right? They have meanings and they have purposes behind these rules, right? So again, going back to this, it's halal, nothing wrong with it. That's really a huge problem in terms of our understanding, thinking about these various layers and contexts, and then thinking a little bit about the fact that I would just say that, this whole secret marriage thing is a bid'ah. This is a really great definition. This is a true bid'ah, right? That's introduced not by the awam in the countryside, like many bid'ahs in Islamic history. This is introduced by the people who know the loopholes, who are the scholars. Introduced by them because, again, ordinary believers, we grow up going to walimas, we know what marriage looks like. So some people who know the little rules and the little tiny holes that they can jump through, right? That they figured that out, and now people think, oh, is this okay? Sheikh Fulan is doing it, must be okay, right? So it's not just introduced by, but also exacerbated by, because frankly, when your friend, your brother is engaged in a secret marriage, then you don't really want to take this issue on, obviously, or you yourself were, or you don't want to be outed, or so-and-so in your institution. So the inability to directly and effectively address this issue has to do with the failure of many of the people of knowledge. And of course, the people of knowledge are hundreds of thousands of people, but then we hear about 2-3 dozen examples of crazy people, and then we think all of the imams have lost their minds. But in reality, it's a small subset, but it's numerous enough for it to be a problem. And of course, there's a lot that we can say and to address those with moral leadership in the community, but I won't do that now. And I think we already know the responsibility and the accountability that the people of knowledge have to act in ways that are becoming of that knowledge as well. And then thirdly, to institutionalize sound marriage practices. So as I mentioned, in Muslim legal practice and application of rules, it's very commonplace and standard to suspend permissible or valid transactions or engagements, and to institutionalize one madhab's position. So in Islamic history, the Ottomans would just say, even though they were Hanafis, they would say, we're Hanafis, however, on this particular issue, the Hanafi madhab is too difficult or too whatever, doesn't apply. We're going to use the Maliki opinion for all of the people in the Ottoman lands. That's the opinion that we're going to apply and to follow, right? So I would just say that the Maliki definition of a secret marriage and the Maliki requirement of proclamation, there's very good reason for us to institutionalize it as the norm and as the requirement that we have for our communities. And what are some ways of doing that? These are just some suggestions, and the institutionalization of them will require, I think, more time. First of all, obviously, recourse to state institutions in America or in Canada when gross misconduct takes place. So any type of abuse, marriage of minors, things like that, we need to actually refer to and defer to the legal system. But then we also need to take preventative measures. Things like in any Muslim institution, mosque, madrasa, Muslim space like this, you have a code of conduct and you have a code of ethics to which anybody involved, especially those who are teaching or serving on behalf of the community of that institution, that they agree to adhere to. And this is really important because otherwise, when we don't do that, Then we devolve into, but it's okay, there's an opinion, I found it. No, let's just put halal and haram completely off. This is the set of policies and protocols that we are going to apply and institutionalize for this institution, right? And this is consistent with American law of organizations, nonprofits, and it's consistent with our tradition, right? You have the policies don't have to be only from the Quran and the Sunnah. It's what is in the maslahah, the benefit of the community. So something like, for example, that an imam or a religious functionary has a disclosure obligation for a relationship between a teacher and a student. That the minute that an imam or a youth director, whatever in a mosque, that he finds someone that he's interested in marrying, that he declare that to the board, to whoever is above him in the chain of command, that he ceases interaction with that person within the mosque context, and that this be an open, transparent, accountable process, right? We're not the only people dealing with this. Other communities are dealing with it, institutions more broadly in the workplace. There's policies and protocols that you have to have in place as preventative measures. And then for officiants and marriage, people involved in marriages, to have a really clear communication of this invalidity and prohibition of secret marriages, to refuse to officiate secret and plural marriages, to register all Islamic marriages with the state without exception, not to perform a nikah in which guardians are not involved or in which there isn't this meaningful attestation. So all of these rules that we're talking about in recommendations, to institutionalize them as practice, right? And the introduction of women officiants, right? This is actually surprisingly something we have in the Muslim world, right? In places like Palestine, I've seen Egypt, elsewhere, where the officiant who's doing the marriage it's not a requirement of Islamic law, it's just like a custom. It's a custom, right? It's something that, because most people don't know the rules, so they want to go to someone who can definitely make sure they're doing it properly, right? That doesn't have to be a man, it can be a woman, and it is a woman. I'm just saying, this is something that I think having women involved in these positions of that they can, in fact, there's no religious problem with them being involved, we should include them in. And I think there are some women in America through this Office of Marriage, something I can't remember, but they also have some women officiants. And then even to think about having community vetted witnesses that are the sunnah of our ummah, really, to have these people in place. And then finally, to address contributing factors, and this is probably the most challenging thing, but it's in the background, right? So this issue of divorce. So some of these situations have to do with people being too afraid to marry someone publicly, or if they've already been divorced, engage in a second marriage, like a second marriage or divorce in a second round, second attempt, because they're afraid that there's a stigma around the fact that they've been divorced twice or something like that, right? And again, I'm not saying just make divorce no big deal. We have to have a balanced discourse on divorce. It's the most hated of the halal, but it's still halal, right? We want to put it in its place. We're not saying just it doesn't work out in the first year. This person's not really, whatever. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying divorce shouldn't be the end of the world, the end of a woman's chance of ever marrying again, whatever it might be. This is part of this discussion. The second thing is broader discussions around sexuality and lowering the bar to marriage. So if you look at the statistics around premarital relationships, they're very, very high. And I'm not going to quote them, but they're very, very high. So we also have to have this discussion that is also a problem in many parts of the Muslim world, where people have to wait until they're very advanced in age to get married, and that poses certain problems. And some of these secret marriages are happening between young people as well, right? And then finally, the most difficult discussion of all is this discussion around polygyny. But if we really look at the numbers, at least the anecdotal statistics, very unscientific that I have, many of these secret marriages are plural marriages. They're second marriages, right? And this isn't a panacea that if we come up with proper social practices around polygyny, that secret marriages can disappear and all of these marriages are going to be great. It's not all I'm talking about. I'm just saying it's a contributing factor. And we do need to have, separate from secret marriages, we do need to have a discussion around polygyny that we're all kind of avoiding uncomfortably, understandably, right? And I would just say any discussion, okay, so there's a lot to say here. First of all, that Muslim countries have really interesting regulations and ways of doing this, right? And social practices around this. And every time I presented this paper, there's been someone in the audience from Philadelphia who's described the very interesting social practices that African-American community has around plural marriages. That there's a healthy, very healthy culture and a way of holding men in particular responsible for the marriages that they enact, plural marriages in particular, and ways of doing that in America of all places. places that we also need to look at. But I would also say that another thing we need to do separate from all of this, but contributes to this, is the last thing I'm going to say, is to make as a routinized standard practice marriage contract and conditions in marriage contracts. And this is something in Islamic history was standard in many, and we have the documentation, we have the marriage contract examples. They were forms, right? You go to get married, and even if you didn't have in mind that you wanted conditions, they would literally ask you to check off if you wanted in or out. And the in or out were the things that were the most problematic in that time and place. The first one was second marriages, right? Do you want your husband to be in second marriage, or do you want an opt-out of this marriage if he engages in second marriage? The second was, if he moves you from the place he married you, do you want an opt-out of this marriage? If he disallows you from visiting your family and leaving your home, do you want to opt out of this marriage? So let's come up with the 5 top problems in marriage today, especially that make women more vulnerable, and women as a matter of routinized. This isn't like, oh, where is the form for this? No, just as a matter of fact that, and abuse, of course, right? That if he abuses you, that you can opt out of this marriage, that you that in some schools that he's able to give, that's the word, tafweed of the right to divorce yourself in these scenarios, right? Which is even some interesting examples where women would say that if he marries a second wife, I can divorce him from that second wife. Or if he takes a concubine, that I can manipulate that concubine, right? So I'm just saying these aren't new problems, and there's ways, as if we're going to talk about polygyny, that it should be a routinized opt-out. If you want it from the beginning, that you don't want to be part of these arrangements, sign off on that, and there's clarity at the outset, not just around polygyny, but around many other things in marriage. So I'm going to stop there. I have 2 minutes and 15 seconds left for questions, if anyone has any questions.
On the last point you made, first of all, that was amazing. Thank you so much. The last point you made, are there any resources that you are people have done that provide like template contracts or things that we should include? I mean, for example, like we have 3 daughters. Everything you said made me think, I need to put that in there. I need to put that in there. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't actually, I haven't seen any. I have one that I worked on for myself personally that when the imam who did our contract was like, where did you get this from? So I'd be happy to share it with you. And I really, that's something I do want to do. Like I do want to have like, because it's also, there's a lot of filk around it, like different men have different views, but I also think this is one of those situations where I'm very happy to, choose from different methods in that scenario, but I also want to make sure it's above board in that sense. So I think that it's something that inshallah we can do, but I'd be happy to share it with you.
That's a great service, I think.
Oh yeah. I was asking somebody, but they're asking about when the wife is not proposed about the secret marriage. So what is in terms of, I know this, but like, yeah, I was reading mention that too. So she was asking.
Yeah, I mean, this is like it's very, very like it's an affair. Like let's call a spade a spade. The fact that you have a loophole to say that second marriage is valid doesn't excuse that behavior in any way, shape, or form, right? But why is it not a strict requirement of validity? So there's really good historical reason for that. And Ibn Battuta is a great example. If anyone read the stories of Ibn Battuta, he goes from Morocco to the Maldives and China and it's very revealing that everywhere he goes, he's able to marry multiple women, and they know he's Ibn Battuta. He's just there for a few months to observe the people, to judge them negatively and positively, write his thing, and then be a judge for a few months and move on. But the fact is, he actually it wasn't just like he wants to make sure he's chaste and he doesn't want to fall into sin. He actually needed to be married because he couldn't like wash his clothes or do some basic life functions if he didn't have some type of woman in his life, right? No, I'm serious, right? And he's in this place, and then he gets news that wife gave birth to a son that he's never going to meet again. It's a completely different world, and these are not the only things that are completely different in that world. There's a lot that's going on that's different, right? So traveling merchants and traveling scholars was a thing, and they were known. And again, it's not this norm of monogamy and soulmates, and I'm going to find the love of my life and spend the rest of my life. The next thing I know, he's a secret wife. It's not what it's about. It's functionally who's the person that will, marry well into my family, that will provide for me. And that's all that's really, I'm not saying there weren't love marriages, like don't take this to extreme. I'm just saying that was the norm. And essentially, when these traveling merchants and scholars would go off, what would they do? They would leave these bill of divorce with their wives, that they would say that if I'm not, and some of them are like 10 days, this is like documented. Some are 10 days, some are 6 months. If I don't come back, you go to court and you tell them you want a divorce. They actually really don't know when I'm gonna be back. So this is a norm. But again, this is a safeguard that if you're gonna do that and you're not gonna leave me with, you have to leave me with the provisions for the 6 months or the 10 days or whatever it might be. Then some wives would show up to court like day 9 and they'd be like, I'm here, right? And then it's a whole court proceeding. So super interesting, right? But my point is, this wasn't the norm. So for me, if I can understand something within Islamic law that made sense and that was applicable in a rational, reasonable, socially kind of okay way at a certain time and place, I'm cool with that rule. But don't come to me today and be like, I'm gonna do that because it's there. It's not there for you, it's there for Ibn Battuta in the 13th century living a completely different lifestyle. Not for you to fly between Toronto and San Diego to meet with your second family. So I'm just saying, validity, his marriage is valid. Religiously, morally, that's very, very problematic and should be very clear that that's not okay. And Islamic law, broadly construed, is not okay with that, even if that marriage is valid, assuming it really, in fact, is. Right?
Thank you, Dr. Mariam. So the second check out that time, which is fascinating, and I feel like there's many benefits to it. Like comparing those, we're looking to get into marriage, keeping in mind the circumstances that are happening. So in today's 2022, Muslim in the West, what would those key check in, check out examples be? I want to be careful about something.
Yeah, I would just off the top of my head, I would say the polygyny thing is still an issue. I would say maybe freedom of movement isn't, but I would say freedom of employment or education. Like people say, I need to finish my education, I need to work freely. You could even say the breakdown financially of what's my contribution going to be, etc. Abuse, right? Any type of abuse. And again, you can construe that in a certain. Oh, the other one key is if we divorce, which legal system and which set of rules are we going to use? Because that's another huge problem. So you say, wherever we married, we'll divorce according to that or according to a certain legal system, whatever. That's a really important one as well. You could talk about child custody, you could include that. I don't know what else, but those are, the most, and again, I know it's really unromantic when you're getting to know someone and be like, if you do this, and that, I'm gonna divorce you or whatever, but these are real things and these are real problems and it happens all the time. So
are the reasons for secrecy relevant at all? Maybe not for haram, like social studies of what is happening in our community. Needing secret about this. I feel like if you're, I don't know, maybe it's sort of like the elephant in the room that if you're having to keep it a secret, maybe you should ask questions about why do I have to keep this secret, right? I don't know.
Yeah, that's important. To be honest, I think it is important. If it's the two young people who, the family is not Muslim of one of them, and if they know that they're getting married to this dude that they just met, that would be a huge problem, and they're not ready to proclaim. That's one thing. In the Muslim world, I know it often happens because they don't want to lose support, state support. Like in Egypt, if you get remarried, you might lose the pension of the first husband or something like that. But again, that's not secret, that's just unregistered. That's kind of a different thing. But I would say on the whole, it's because the marriage isn't above board in some respect, that it's some type of, union that people want to happen against social norms, social customs, legal norms, legal customs, and they want to do it anyways. And it's, again, if you're doing that, it's pretty much you don't really have lasting intimacy and chastity in mind. It's a short-term thing, because if it is long-term, either you're expecting that the husband's going to divorce his first wife and then marry you, or that the parents, one set of parents is going to get on board. But even then, again, I would say, situations are different, but generally, I would say taking the time with parents is important, but at a certain point, you can still get married without that's not an ideal situation either, but secrecy is also not ideal, and you can't be out together publicly, and then And I mean, like, it's heartbreaking that like fathers and mothers are like looking for spouses for their kids and they don't know the kid's already like secretly married or whatever it might be, right? And these things, they don't last. Like every single story I know about, it's eventually someone threatens to out them and then it's divorce, or the husband loses interest and it's divorce, or whatever. The wife is too afraid it's divorce, right? But yeah, I don't know. I have anecdotal aggregated information, but that's all.
Example of the couple that got married and come back for it. I'm curious if you're would describe a little more why women as
I mean, I think that last point is definitely a factor. Like, I think, I mean, even the discussion on polygyny, like many women wouldn't prefer it, but then they're like, this is better than nothing. But at the other side, I've also been in discussions where women are like, actually, I would love to have a husband half the time or part-time because I actually don't want to deal, and I don't want children. I'm not kidding. Like, I don't want a full-time responsibility of a husband. I want, it's, but you know, if they have a very vibrant career, whatever, but there's a stigma around it, so they're not going to do that, or they're going to do it in secret or something like that. Like a desire for companionship, like that's a very real need. So I think that's one thing. And then I think again, like when you just fall in love with someone, they tell you all these nice things, and then you're like, okay, you're gonna eventually tell your family, we're gonna have this beautiful wedding, and then they, which again, women are much more vulnerable in these situations. And unless you have a reason why your father really shouldn't be involved, like some women are in a situation like that, even if it's, you know, difficult to deal with him or your male relative, like there's a reason why they're there, right? And again, I don't subscribe to this, like women don't know what they're doing, they have no experience in the world, they don't know men. I'm not saying that, I'm just saying it's also yet another person to vet them from a different perspective, and they're not just your guardian, it's the entire family that should be involved in that process. Okay.
عليكم. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. I'm still kind of soaking in everything that Mariam said, Dr. Mariam. So I'm trying to gather myself. SubhanAllah, like despite having learned a lot about fiqh, these really important topics are not really spoken about. Like people will speak about Zabiha or non-Zabiha, and they'll talk about it all day and all night, and moon sighting all day and all night, but protecting women is really important. SubhanAllah, yeah. So what I wanted to talk about today is helping those who have been harmed in situations of spiritual abuse. And mainly not in the parent-child relationship, but in other relationships. The parent-child relationship is very different, and that takes a lot of intense healing work. But from a perspective of someone who has come and gone into a spiritually abusive situation and then has come out of it, we're hearing a lot about it, and we're hearing, you know, it comes in bursts. And when those bursts come, there are things that happen to us, maybe as the person who has not been in the abusive situation, and then there's things that happen to the person who was in that situation. For a person who's just hearing about it, something that oftentimes happens a lot is emotional flooding. And so emotional flooding is basically like it sounds. It's almost like someone takes this bucket
of emotions and they pour it over your head and you have no idea what to do with yourself. Like, I'm hearing about this again. I don't think I can handle this. Or I don't want to hear about this. I just, I'm going to act like it didn't happen. Or, okay, I'm going to go burn down the mosque because I can't handle this happening again. And it's emotional flooding, and it's something that paralyzes you, or it pushes you into fighting something, or it pushes you into wanting to escape. So, fleeing the Muslim community, which we see a lot. And it's really, really important to realize that simply because something did not happen to you does not mean that you can't be traumatized by it. And subhanAllah, one thing that I see in my practice a lot is that a person who has been in a situation that is traumatizing will come and say, hey, I need help because I'm traumatized, because I know I am, because XYZ happened to me. And then other people will come and they'll say, I'm just defective because nothing happened to me, nothing's wrong with me, but I'm not functioning properly. And so because we don't have this collective knowledge that I can be vicariously traumatized, then a person who is vicariously traumatized doesn't take the time to heal from that which they've heard or that which they've seen. And we forget that as human beings, we are so interconnected. We feel the emotions of others, and we experience, simply sitting next to people can change the way that your heart beats. So there's something called heart rate variability, and it's a big science. But basically, me sitting next to Dr. Mariam, if Dr. Mariam is in a state of peace, and her state of peace is stronger than my state of unrest, then my heart can actually begin to beat in a way that throws my system into peace. And if I'm sitting next to Dr. Mariam and my state of, say, anxiety is much stronger than her state of peace, her heart can start to sync up with mine and start beating in a way that ignites anxiety into her, and she has no idea why. Right? So we are very, very interconnected. We are affected by one another in ways that are starting to be explained by science, but that have been told to us, from the Prophet ﷺ a long time ago. And so there's many different definitions for trauma, but one of the ones that really resonates with me is too much, too fast, and the key here is without adequate resourcing. So two people can go through the same exact situation or hear the same exact story, and one person can be fully traumatized by it and have to go through years of counseling for it. And another person can have gone through the same thing, but because they have either inner or outer adequate resourcing, they feel the pain, they process the pain, and then they move on. They're not traumatized. And it's the same event. So adequate resourcing is important. And adequate resourcing, again, can come internally. It can be from coping mechanisms you learned as a child. Your parents, they taught you healthy emotional tactics, or you learned them in school, or alhamdulillah, you were just blessed with them, but also it comes from the outside. So adequate resourcing is having someone to listen to you, having someone to witness you, having someone to look at you and say, wow, that was really hard. And the most traumatic thing that can happen to a person is actually not the trauma itself, but it's being left alone with the trauma that happened to you. And so even a lot of the rhetoric around psychology today that's starting to come out is that every time we're put in a traumatic situation, will actually, if we have adequate resourcing, if we have someone to be there with us through it, and we don't have to go through it alone, it will strengthen us. But if you are isolated after your trauma, it can break you. And so first and foremost, when you hear about something like this or something traumatic happens in the community, then you have to check in with yourself. A lot of times our immediate reaction is to get up and run and find the person and help them, which is really important. We have to support those who are harmed. But you also have to make sure that you are in a state that you can actually go and help the person and not further traumatize them or further harm them with your own baggage. And so ask yourself, how are you being resourced? Do you have the adequate internal resourcing, or do you need to find someone from the outside to come and help you, just co-regulate or just listen to you or just let you cry? So much resourcing can happen simply by sitting with someone and saying, I'm really sad. And you don't even have to tell them why. Just, I'm really sad, and that person saying, okay, I'm here. And so do you need someone from the outside to come in and to help you? Is it within your capacity right now to self-regulate? Or do you need to reach out to someone to help you co-regulate before you can be of aid to others? And the first self-regulation technique, always, 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 beyond a doubt, is getting connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And immediately when you have this emotional flooding, before you run to the person next to you, before you do anything, start doing azkar. Even if you're not concentrating, even if you technically don't believe it in the moment, you need to go and do the azkar, because basically this can bring back the life into your heart, and it can actually inform you what resourcing you need, because you're basically in a state in which you're frozen or you're in fight or flight mode. And so you need to come back into your body, come back into yourself, reconnect with your heart, connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before you can even begin to think in a state that will be beneficial for yourself or for someone else. And while you're doing dhikr, the beneficial thing to do is actually to breathe. And to make sure that you're actually saying pronouncing every single letter that is in your dhikr, and to also realize that we have the cure to all things, and that is in La ilaha illallah. So simply to put your hand on your heart, begin to breathe, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, until you come to a state where you can actually ask, okay, what do I need right now? If I don't need anything, what can I do? And again, you don't have to feel what you're saying. It's really nice to feel what you're saying when you're doing dhikr. But if you think about it, if you're starving and you go and you eat, you're not going to afterwards be like, oh man, I wasn't even, present in my food. I should eat again. Now you're going to be like, okay, I ate. Alhamdulillah, I got the sustenance I need next time. I really hope I'm present. But, so I can enjoy my food, but I needed that in this moment. You might have to write about it. You might have to cry about it. You might need to even just go give someone a hug. Give yourself the space and the acceptance of feeling, and don't put any shoulds on your feeling. Like, oh, I shouldn't be sad, or I should be used to this by now. I shouldn't have expected. Just let yourself feel. And you don't need to be okay simply because it didn't happen to you. You need to allow space for your own grief and your disappointment, or you're not going to have the capacity to hold space for someone else's grief and their disappointment. And that goes back to, we say, فَقْدِ الشَّيْءِ لَا يُعْطِي. If you don't have something, you can't give it. If you don't know how to hold space for yourself, you're not going to be able to hold space for someone else in a way that is embodied and adequate. The next thing, which is going to hit people's nuts just a little bit, is don't seek the details. You heard about it. In order to help someone, you don't need to know the details. You don't need to go and read all the blogs. You don't need to go and read all the Facebook posts. If and only if you need to, which is, there are certain people in our communities who need to be informed in order for them to take certain types of action. If you're not that person, then don't do it. Don't spend hours Googling, because basically what you're doing is you're further and traumatizing yourself and deepening that trauma in a way that is only going to prevent you from being of aid to others. Islamically, even, we're only supposed to be concerned with that which concerns us. So in a situation like this, if I hear about it, for someone like me, who I don't have the role of seeking justice or preventing this from happening, then what actually concerns me is, okay, where is the human being who I can put some love into, or I can support? It shouldn't be small talk. or, you know, casual talk at gatherings, you guys go out for dinner, and it's like, oh, did you hear what happened? Yeah, so did this, and then this happened, and then that, and it's not gonna help you. If anything, it's gonna desensitize your heart, or it's going to harden your heart. If you're able to be of assistance to a person who's been affected by the situation, by the trial, and one of the most important things is to do this whole space and be a compassionate witness. Don't seek to be around them simply to know more of the story. Be around them because you actually care about them and because you actually want their heart to not carry so much pain on its own. People can feel it, you know, they might not be able to verbalize it. They might not be able to say, you're here simply because you want to know or simply because you want to be in the in, but they'll feel off, or they won't be able to receive the love that you have the potential to give. And then also realize that being with someone who is going through complicated grief, which is usually in this situation, it's very complicated. It's not a normal grief is like someone passes away, your elderly family member passes away and then you grieve. That's normal grief. But here a trauma has happened, so we go into complicated grief. And it's not always very understandable. And it's not linear. And it's really confusing sometimes as a person who's in it or a person who's watching it. And there's different stages of grief. There's denial, there's anger, there's bargaining, there's sadness or depression or loneliness, and then there's acceptance. And when you read about it online, you're like, okay, step 1, I'm through denial. Step 2, I've gotten through the anger. But it's not like that. It's like, in this moment, I'm in denial. Next moment, I'm angry. Then I'm about to accept. Then I'm bargaining. And then I'm making excuses for the person. And if you're actually being a compassionate witness and you're holding space, and the person is sharing this with you, you're going to be like, I don't understand what's happening. Like, are you okay with it? Are you not okay with it? What do I do? And it's just important to realize it's their process. And your job is not to judge where they are in their process or if they're almost healed or not. It's really just to hold that space. Like, okay, I'm here for as long as I can be here, and then I'm going to go recover, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to be here again. So they're grieving a lot of things. They're grieving their understanding of the relationship that they had. They're grieving their loss of safety. They're grieving, a lot of times they're grieving things from their childhood that immediately was triggered by being put in this kind of a situation. And again, sometimes it doesn't make sense, and that's okay. And it's important that you be a safe place for them, and that you're not a person who will take the information and put it somewhere else and give it to someone else. And, you know, there's this really strange TikTok or Instagram or some kind of trend in which people they have this video in which, I don't know what it is exactly, but they will say, if you tell me something, then it's only between you and I, and then they'll do this like zip thing, and then they'll take the lock and they'll throw it to someone behind them, as in like, oh, my sister or my husband or my brother, as in it's not going to be shared to anybody except for the one I always share everything with, right? And that's not what we're here to do. A secret is a secret. A safe space is a safe space. I don't go and share this information with someone else simply because it's the juicy in knowledge. That's, again, breaking their trust. So yeah, you might not have abused them in a way that traumatized them, but you as well are being wronged, and you are wronging them by breaking their trust, and that's a really big thing. And you also have to be okay listening to the same story over and over and over and over again until the person feels that they've actually been seen and that they've gotten this story out. Sometimes we see this in children, you know, like the child falls, or, you know, they go through something really intense, and they'll tell the story over and oh, I fell out of the tree and I scraped my knee. I fell out of the tree and I scraped my knee. And they'll tell the person at the supermarket, and they'll tell their dad, and they'll tell their mom, and they'll tell their grandma, and they'll tell their grandpa, and they'll tell the story over and over and over, and then suddenly the story stops. And you're like, wait, what? We're done with that story? But it's finally, they're done. They're done telling that story. And it's the same thing for adults. I always say that adults are just children who have learned to hide. And we have the same needs. We have the needs of connection, the needs of witnessing, the needs of being heard, and the needs of being seen. But we now have really fancy words that make it sound like we don't need these things. Don't be a person who constantly reminds them of what they've been through. Let them know that you are there for them and you're ready to hear what they have to say, but don't continuously push them to retell their story over and over. Like, oh, but you still seem sad. Okay, why don't you tell me about it again? Why don't you tell me about it again? Because there are certain times where they actually just need to be silent and to process internally. If you find that they're going into a depressive state or they're going into an unhealthy state, you can address that and say, you know, I feel like you're going into this state. Is there something I can help you with? But don't push what you think will be the most healing for them. If you find that you're done being able to be of support, don't project it on them. So I see this a lot with people who have been through something difficult. They have people around them in the beginning who are really supportive, and that person is just ready to be there for them night and day. Any time of the day you call me, any time of the night, I'm gonna be there. And then slowly, little by little, they get compassion fatigue, and they're just tired of hearing the same story over and over. And instead of being aware that I'm tired, I should take a step away, they'll start putting it on the other person, like, okay, halas, it's been a year. It's time for you to move on. It's over. It's done. You need to move on with your life. That's not your place. Even if you think that, even if you feel that, you need to take a step back and actually assess, okay, why am I so annoyed that they haven't healed yet? If it's because I want them to heal, is it really going to help them if I tell them you're overreacting, heal already? It's not. Listen to what kind of struggle they're having and try to become aware of what the root of this struggle is. So if it's a struggle that they're having with faith, then maybe you can try and find them someone who is knowledgeable, who can sit with them and who can dispel some myths. If it's something that is more like a complicated grief that you can't help and you feel like they really need professional help, then seek a counselor who would be understanding in this kind of situation. So that's another thing that I see, is that a lot of times people in the Muslim community will be traumatized by someone in the Muslim community, and then they'll go to a counselor who has no connection to the Muslim community, no knowledge of Islam, no knowledge of the culture, and it'll basically eventually take them away from Islam, because all they'll hear is, yep, that's abuse. Oh, that law is wrong. Oh, this is wrong. Okay, what do you like? And then if they have anger, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is a lot of times a normal part of the process, rather than helping them to return to seeing where their trauma actually is, a lot of times those counselors will say, okay, well, if you're angry with God, why do you worship him? And that's not what they need at that time. They need to be connected, or they don't need that any connection. Just like in the beginning, you had to take inventory of yourself. So long as you're being there for the person, you have to take inventory of yourself constantly. You have to basically do muraqabah of yourself. And that's not just about seeing if your actions are valid or not, but okay, do I still have the capacity to do this work? Do I still have the capacity to see a person and talk to them and be there for them? And if I don't, then I need to take a step back. And that might sound like, I really, really love you. I'm gonna have to go do some things for the next week. I'm not gonna be available, but I would really like to talk to you in the following week, and actually being conscious about that. Not obviously telling them like, your story has drained me, I'm gonna, cut out. And you're laughing. But there is a huge movement these days of radical honesty. And radical honesty is going through all of our relationships and breaking them down. Marital relationships, friends, we don't have something called radical honesty at all. We have honesty with wisdom. There are certain things you say and there are certain things you don't. It's kind of like even within like healthy marriages, sometimes I'll have a couple come and they'll start telling me like, oh, we have a problem because I was feeling this about someone. Like the wife was feeling some emotions towards the man. So I went home and told my husband and we had a discussion about it. And now he's feeling this towards that girl. And so we're having this discussion. I'm like, why are you guys having this discussion? Radical honesty. excuse me? Like, what? There are certain things that you have to heal and you have to deal with internally. Every time your nafs speaks, you don't have to speak it out loud in the guise of radical honesty. It's not a thing. Again, grieving and healing don't have set timelines. Some people will heal very fast. Like there are certain situations that have come to me where I'm like, subhanAllah, we are going to be here for years because this is big. And weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and this person has completely transformed, and not out of like pushing away their feelings, but actually transformed. And there are certain people who will come and it'll be a very, very seemingly small issue, but it takes us years to get. And that's because all of the tools that we're using, holding space, actually witnessing people, giving them love, giving them care, all of these are asbab. And the true healer is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for some people, that journey is long for its own wisdoms. And for some people, that journey is very short. And we are not people who should come and judge the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you can be there for them, be there for them. And if you can't, pray for them. Do something. Don't just hold on to the situation without actually acting. The action is either I'm going to pray for you and help you, or I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to put this emotion that I'm feeling into something and I'm going to make dua. It's the most important thing that you can do. And, again, you can have all of the tools in the book. You can have a PhD in psychotherapy, or you can have hundreds of years, not hundreds, 50 years of experience. And one prayer can be more powerful than anything that you've ever learned. The second most important thing is to, again, actually see them, to witness them. So the first one is to hold space, and the other one is to actually witness them. And witnessing does not sound like, oh my God, I know exactly how you feel. When I heard it, I was really sad, because you don't know exactly how they feel. Even if you were in the exact same situation before, you don't know exactly how they feel. And so it's really important that when you witness someone, you don't say, I know how you feel, but you can basically mirror to them what you're seeing. So, wow, it sounds like that's incredibly difficult. It sounds like you're going through a lot. I don't know exactly how you feel, but I'm here and I'm listening and I'm really trying to understand. And that in and of itself opens up the space for them to try to explain to you what they're actually going through. But when you say, oh my God, I know exactly how you feel, that's a closing. They're like, okay, well then, you think you know how I feel, why am I gonna bother telling you anyway? And another thing that should not happen is don't say, yeah, you know what, I heard a story about this the other week, and then, tell them further. A lot of us, whenever someone's in a difficult situation, we end up making it about us. I know this story, I heard about this story, and that's not helping them at all. Right now, you're just a mirror. When I go to the mirror in the morning and I'm checking my hijab, it's not suddenly telling me something different. Like literally all I see is myself and my hijab and what I need to fix. And so we need to be those mirrors where we're not bringing ourselves into the situation. And just realize again that, subhanAllah, we're in a dunya in which we are all human. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He told us, وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضَكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ فِتْنَةً أَتَصْبِرُونَ. It's already been told. We will be a trial and a test to one another. And what we're asked to do is to be patient. Not to be patient with abuse, as in not to allow abuse to come to us, but to be patient with that which comes after. So to block it, to put the boundaries, to end it, but then be patient with the feelings, with the emotion, the healing journey. To be patient, and the entire time that you're in that patience, you need to constantly be returning to your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you feel it and when you don't feel it, because we're not people who simply act on how we feel. We know that there are things that and it's the same thing, if you went to the doctor and they told you you have the sickness, and if you don't take the proper remedy on time every day, then you will, get extremely sick and it's going to be hard to cure it. Then, you're going to wake up the first day and you're like, yeah, I want to take the medicine because I'm going to heal. I'll take the medicine because I'm going to heal. Day 3, you're like, I am so tired of how this tastes, but I'm going to take the medicine because I have to. And you're like, no, I'm not going to take it, and then get angry at the doctor that you didn't get better. And our medicine is always connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we feel it, when we don't feel it. And if you're in the presence of someone who's hurting and they're not in the state in which they can do dhikr for them. And you don't have to tell them, like, I'm doing dhikr for you, or like they're talking and then you're like, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, right? No, but like actually while they're talking in your heart, intend to do dhikr on their behalf and to gift it to them. Or to do dhikr and to hope that the effect that it has on your heart has an effect on their heart. I just pray that inshallah we are all protected from the pain that can be caused by others and the pain that we get from harming others as well. And that we're all tools of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth to help in the healing journeys of other people. And knowing that we are simply asbab, that every single thing that we do, every position that we're put in order to help someone through their healing journey is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala working through us. And it's an honor, it's not a burden.
You mentioned about keeping secrets. So, other advice when someone talks us to the subject of useful and what guidance from someone else. We still don't want to break. Is there such a rule or benefit or wise approach to contact that we don't want to feel like
I don't know about rule, that would be out of my jurisdiction, but I would say like some tips on that. It would really depend on the situation. For some people, they would really be accepting to hear, I have no idea how to help you, but I'm here. And if you'd like, I can go and seek help. Some people wouldn't be okay with that. And so in those situations, then what I usually do is I go to someone who is wise that I can trust. And I tell the story with as little detail as possible, right? So I tell it in a way that maybe the person won't know who the person is, or I say, this was in confidence, but I need help. And I need help figuring out what to do in this situation. Can you please help me? But that's very different than this secret that's bubbling inside of me and I just have to tell someone. It's just one person, right? But if it's seeking advice, then I would say as much as you can, keep the secret. And if you can't, then keep it as anonymous as possible. And then also if there is an opportunity to refer out to this person, like if this person would be willing to hear it, then I would say do that, because it might actually be a means for their circle of support to actually grow. Like I'm here and I'm listening to you and I'm holding space, but I can't help you, but so-and-so might. And so then that immediately took them from having one support to two. But of course it depends on the situation.
Last question. Holding space for someone. This is more of a shortcoming with me. I tend to lose patience. So what happens when you are just so frustrated? And it's probably me projecting my issues, but at what point you say I cannot hold space?
So that's when it goes back to taking inventory with yourself. If you've reached the point where you're like, nope, can't do this anymore, then you probably weren't taking inventory at the beginning to take the space and the breaks, or there's not proper boundaries. We don't simply allow ourselves to have people dump all the time. You also have to be in the state in which you can accept it. And usually the proper etiquette is the person who needs to vent will say, I'm going through a hard time. Do you have a moment so that I can talk to you about this? Or is this a good time? And then you can say, actually, no. Or you can like, no, but we can talk about this at a different time. Or you say yes, but that doesn't always happen because sometimes people are just bubbling with whatever's going through them. So then it becomes our responsibility to, with tact and with kindness, to be able to put those boundaries for ourselves and to be like, I really want to hear what you have to say. I'm not in the personal state right now in which I can listen to this story, but I do want to be of support to you, or I can help you by connecting you with someone else. And it's hard when people don't accept those boundaries, but it is very important to be able to put those boundaries, not because we value boundaries in themselves, but because we value the results of the boundaries, which is you won't lose patience with them. You won't end up saying something that is hurtful or making them feel small. Instead, they'll be like, oh, wow, she didn't even want to listen to me, rather than she belittled me, or she didn't think my problem was big enough, or whatever it might be.
Just backing on the question of secrecy, slightly different sort of situation. If the trauma that you experience is one that can be processed in group settings, more specifically, if the trauma affects multiple people and they can sort of all kind of grieve together, but those other people don't know that it's happened. They haven't been affected by the trauma yet, but in your sort of what's happened. You want to process, but you can't because those people don't know, and you don't want to be a person to include them in that. Is there that sort of obligation of secrecy, or can you still reveal?
I don't think I understood the situation. How would you be honest without being radically honest? I'll give you a very cliche question. Your significant other just bought a really beautiful dress and she's really excited about it. And she's putting it on in front of the mirror and she says, do these make my hips look big? And you're like, oh my God, they're huge. That's called radical honesty, right? But there's other way either. If you want, if you're like, oh, she would prefer to be covered up or whatever, it might be like, the dress is really nice, but maybe you can put a cardigan on it. I think it would accentuate the out. That's honesty there versus radical honesty. And so I'm not saying we need to institute secrecy in our relationships, but we need to institute wise honesty. Things that we can be honest with a person without hurting them or harming them. Makes sense. I mean, and we learn that when we're little, right? Like, if you have something nice to say, you say it. And if you don't, you stay quiet. So you can figure out how to say it nicely. But the current trend is that we want to dissolve all of the principles that we've ever learned and create a new world for some reason, which also comes to that. Like, people will say things like, oh my God, your hair looks really ugly. It's like, what? Really? I just have to be radically honest. No, you don't. You don't have to, right? And I know these are very like silly and simple examples, but they're really just to make it a little bit more understandable. Does that make sense? Or do you have a more specific question about that? No? Yes.
What's that specialist? Jamaal talked about the power of Quran as a ruqya in calming an anxious state or calming an anxious person. Even I've heard even like heals depression. Just by saying a set of ayat or reading Quran, and from yesterday also, like we talked about, like you have to talk to the chef who will give you a prescription. We're talking about different subjects anyway. Is there anything wrong about like having kind of like a prescription of reading certain ayats, say ayat or will allow have certain numbers and things as ruqya or certain medical or emotional issues. Is that wrong?
I defer to you. You know more about these things.
When you say a certain number, like, what do you mean? You've decided that this is the certain number that if I do them, I will be healed, or is it just I like to do these certain numbers of things? And
Not me. I mean, like, for example, like you go to YouTube and you say, you read Quran and you read like that, you know, is like ruqyas, for example, ruqyas for healing, and those are set of certain. It's not there like just opening the book and reading Quran out like that, but there are certain ayahs that protects you. Like we know, like since I was little, I was told like whenever you're afraid or something, and I teach that, I taught that to my kids. Just whenever you're afraid, read ayat kursi, like, and I always imagine like a shield. Nothing's gonna happen to me because I have the protection of Allah. I have the protection of faith in a way. But if I read it and I put the protection of Allah, that's the intention. But I had an experience of illness in the family, and I've taken kind of a prescription of certain ayats to read and prayers to do, and subhanAllah, it was a miracle. But in me, it's the miracle of Allah that brought that a world of that to see the healing of Quran in a miraculous way. But I always in the back of my mind. So this is a prescription from a very pious person to heal whatever was going on at that time. Is that wrong?
so it was like a sheikh that you got a prescription from.
The sheikh is a pious person. It's very pious person. Like I understood from your talk before, like your experience of Shaykh Jamaal Diwan taking your baby at a retreat and just reading. And it was that set of, put out the club, whatever the same, those things that we know, like everybody knows, knows that how to protect.
You guys were going to say something.
I'll
say something.
Okay.
You say something.
Well, this verse is the Quran is shifa, right? It's all shifa. And what we were talking about before was a little bit different, but there are certain people that can give you very, very beautiful prescriptions, and we have in past examples of things that are called like mujarrabat, in which there are certain prescriptions which have been tried and then they have beautiful results by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in general, I've always been taught by my teachers that the Quran in and of itself, if you have the prescription, if you don't have the prescription, it is incredibly healing, and it is incredibly powerful. And reciting it, even subhanAllah, now they're doing a lot of studies on somatically how reciting the Quran affects the nervous system, and it's lovely and it's really great, but we already know that. Like, we don't need a published study to come and say, oh yes, if you actually read the Quran, then you'll be healed. Like, I don't care what the study ends up saying. I already know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told me that if I read this Quran on myself, if I read this Quran on my child, I'm going to be protected, I'm going to be inshallah connected, and I'm going to be healed inshallah.
I would say in brief to your question that there's two major possibilities for reciting something in particular to deal with some situation. There's maybe three possibilities. First possibility is we're reciting something that has been clearly prescribed by the Prophet ﷺ himself. Which in that case, it's very clear, you know. Ayat al-Kursi, so on and so forth, other verses as well. You know, there's different verses that have different hadith, some of them more strong, less strong, but they're there. This is one category. The second category is what we have, things that are mujarradat, that over centuries and over experiences of righteous people and so on, they found that when this happens, you say this. And they might have it, maybe they had a true dream, maybe they had something, but it's mujarrab at some level. Mujarrab means like, essentially it's tried and true. It's been tried and it works. And so if you have something like that from, you could say like a sound source, that's fine too. Third possibility is you're just kind of like making up something yourself or something, you know, whatever, like it just came out of left field. Then if it's the Quran, you're probably still okay because it's the Quran. You know, but there's a lot of things that float around in that realm that are not always the Quran. They're like, make this dua or say this thing or say that thing, or they say you recite this thing from the Quran and when you look, it's not even actually from the Quran. Well, there's a lot of shady stuff that happens in this realm too. So, but basically, if it's from a text or if it's from some sort of reliable source and it's been tried and true, and it's part of, it can be part of our. Like oftentimes we take multiple means to seek a solution to something, right? So that might be part of what we do. Part of what we might do is like go to the doctor, right? Or whatever else it might be that is necessary in that situation.
It is very hard. It's very hard in established dynamics. So like in family settings or in friends that you've had for a really long time. And like maybe you weren't aware before that you needed the boundaries, so that's what you're like, actually I don't need any boundaries because I have the capacity, but I was realized, oh, I'm doing this. One thing I'll say is you try to be as tactful as possible, and you try to get your space in a way that is not hurtful, like, oh, I'm going to be busy for a while, or I'm going to be busy tomorrow, can I talk at a different time, or they start definitely being subhanAllah, I really want to hear what you have to say, but just at this moment, I don't have the capacity, I don't have the space. And for a lot of people, that's very scary because their response is not always, usually, unless the person really also respects boundaries and has boundaries in their life. So usually the response is not good. It's not like, yay, you're taking space for yourself. So it's more like, excuse me, are you gonna leave me all alone? No, we can't do that. And it's about really realizing that we're not here to please people. We're here to do good by people, and we're here to do our best and to help people. And a lot of times when we actually help people, they're not always happy. Just like, again, you can go back to the children's example. A lot of times when we help our children or when we teach our children something that's really, really healthy, it ends up with a tantrum on the floor. And if you then say, okay, then I'll never ever teach my child again because I don't want the tantrum, then you're acting like you're there to please your child, but you're not. You're there to help your child grow. And obviously it's different in a relationship when you are not a parent, because we're not here to make others feel small. But it is important to realize that there will be certain situations where you do what is the healthiest for both of you. And the person feels betrayed, or the person feels like you didn't do enough. And it's just important to reset your intention. I'm here to help you. I'm here to hold space for you. But I also have to take care of myself. It's this internal dialogue. And I have to make sure that whatever I do is the best that I can give. And the best that I can give is to make sure that I can be there for you in the times that I can, by making sure that when I can't be there for you, that I have to take a step back. And again, it's hard. Boundaries are hard. And if boundaries were easy, we wouldn't have to talk about them so much, honestly. But boundaries are really hard and they're not accepted very well. And it's just about doing it with love and doing it with tact. And if you get a response that is not the ideal response, to not take it personally and to continue to be there for the person when you can in the boundaries that you have set. So a lot of times people will try to set a boundary and they'll be like, I really can't talk right now because I'm not feeling well, or I'm not. And the person will not handle it very well. So then the other person will then also close up and be like, oh, wow, well, if you don't see my humanity, then I don't want to be there for you ever. I don't have to say it, but they can feel that. And so it's really important to take a step back and assess your intention and realize that I'm putting this boundary because I want to help the person. I want to be there for the person. And inshallah, when I have the capacity, I will come back and I'll be there for them within the set boundaries that I have.
I think we should stop for Maghrib. Maybe last question.
The parents? Yes. So I think there's such thing as sharing too much with anybody. Your parents, your siblings. We have to be wise about who we share with. Who we share our triumphs with, who we share our pains with, who we share our failures with, who we share anything with, honestly. And we need to share that which we need to share in order to process, especially when it comes to grief and pain. And again, as a person who is in grief or who is in pain, I also need to take inventory of myself. Am I sharing this simply because I don't want to do the healing work and I just want to put it on someone else because I'm tired of it? Or do I actually need to share this because I have a need to be witnessed, or I have a need to heal from something? If you know that your parent, for example, is the type of person who will then use it against you later on, then find another safe space. We don't have to share our deepest emotions with any one given person. We need to share it with the person who will be our companion on the healing journey. And if you don't find that person, and you don't have that person, then I would say make dua for that person. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He answers all of our du'as. He answers the du'as, and He will send you someone who can be the safest space that you could ever imagine, and the most beneficial healing companion, if you just ask for it, instead of defaulting to, well, I don't have anybody else, so let me go to this person. Or when going into despair and saying, well, I'm all alone, everyone's already left. It's somewhere in the middle. It's okay, this person is not healthy and I actually don't have anybody else to talk to, so let me beg Allah for this, and then keep my eyes open for the answers that Allah sends. Because a lot of times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers our dua, but we're so busy looking at what we don't have that we don't see what He has actually sent.
Right. I think we should close so we can bring Maghrib and have dinner. The dinner is outside, so we still have dinner tonight. It is Maghrib, right? Because we went into this room. Okay. They went at time work. So we'll pray Maghrib, inshallah, then we'll have dinner. We'll be here for dinner, so if there's other questions and things we want to talk about, we can talk. Barakallahu feekum. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. We have had the opportunity over the years to host a lot of female teachers actually at the masjid. And I think that the ladies' retreat was a tremendous accomplishment. Sheikh Muslima, the volunteers and the team who came. And tonight is special in some ways because these two people, mashallah, I know how much my wife loves them and how much she looks up to them, how much she feels that they're people of benefit for her and for others. And so we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from them. And of course I see that as well. I know very intimately because of how much I know from her. So we pray that Allah blesses both of you and protects you and your families and gives you good and rewards you for everything that you did in coming out here and for everything that you will do in the future as well. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all my needs. So, inshallah, we'll try to pray Maghrib here, I think, since the roads are here, and then we'll have dinner outside. I think Marcus here's good. Okay. Inshallah. Thank you both, mashallah. Really.